The work that I'm going to talk about is based on these two papers over here. One I wrote in April, and then another one I wrote with my Stony Brook collaborators, Christopher Beam, Leonardo Rastelli, and Walt Van Ries, which came out this month. Okay. So my goal of this talk will be an attempt to try to understand how to compute things in string theory at finite coupling. Okay. But before I do that, let me begin by briefly recalling why we cannot use standard perturbation theory to address questions of this kind. Okay. And the problem, of course, comes from the fact that generically perturbation expansion in a quantum field theory is an asymptotic expansion, which means that it has zero radius of convergence. And string perturbation theory is also expected to be an asymptotic expansion, okay, and hence have zero radius of convergence. Now, we'll try to gain some insight into the nature of asymptotic expansion, and for this it's useful to look at some example. Okay. So here is a simple example of a function whose expansion is asymptotic. Okay. So if we think of this as a function of this coupling constant g, okay, it's just a simple one-dimensional integral. It also has an exact expression in terms of modified Bessel functions of the second kind. But what we can do is to expand out this exponent in power series in g and carry out the x integrals to produce a perturbation expansion of this form. Okay. But then if we look at this coefficient over here, okay, for large n, this grows as n factorial, and which says that however small this coupling constant g may be, the series is divergent. Okay, successive terms for sufficiently large n will always grow, and hence this has vanishing radius of convergence. Now, to gain some pictorial insight into the nature of asymptotic expansion, it's also useful to look at a plot. So what I plotted here is the ratio of the first, third, and seventh order perturbative results to f of g as a function of g. Okay. So if the function had agreed with f of g, we will get the horizontal line 1. Okay. And we see that at small enough coupling, of course, all the functions do quite well. Okay. In fact, the higher order expansion, higher order terms, in fact, do better at sufficiently weak coupling. But none of them do so well at finite or large coupling. Okay, say around here. And in fact, the problem becomes more and more severe as to go to higher and higher order in perturbation theory. Okay, so around this region, the first order expansion is a little better than the third order, and that's better than the seventh order. Okay. And this is what illustrates that asymptotic expansion cannot be directly used for finding even the approximate value of the function at a finite coupling. Now, the strategy that we will be following is the discovery since the mid 1990s that many string theories and quantum field theories have strong weak coupling duality, okay, which says that a string theory or a quantum field theory with coupling g is equivalent to another or sometimes the same string theory or a quantum field theory with coupling 1 over g. And hence the theory for large g can be studied using the dual theory at small g. And the question that we will try to address is it possible to use this to the question of what happens at finite coupling? Okay. Now, what I will be describing will at best give an approximate result for at finite coupling, not an exact result. Okay, but even an approximate result probably will be better than having no result at all, and that's what I will attempt to do. So here is the strategy. So in a dual pair of theories, any physical quantity, let's call it f of g, can be studied both at small g and large g. In particular, we have a Taylor series expansion of f of g at both ends. What we'll try to do is to combine both informations into one single function, okay, and then use that function to gain insight as to what could be the value of the function f at a finite value of g. So we'll discuss in detail one class of such functions, okay, which seems to work particularly well, at least for a wide class of functions. And these class of functions will be based on what I'll call fractional power of polynomials. Okay, and the origin of the name will become clear in the next slide. Okay, but this is not the only one which can be used. Often, okay, although not always, other functions like say multi-point Paddy approximants can be used, and we will also compare the results of this with other methods. So here in one slide is the strategy that we will be following for constructing this function. Okay. So suppose we know that the function f of g has a weak coupling expansion of this form. Okay, so it starts with some exponent g to the a, and then it has a series expansion in powers of g. Okay. Suppose you also know that strong coupling, the function has a similar expansion, but this time in powers of g inverse. Okay, and it typically begins with some other exponent g to the b. Okay. Given this, we will define the approximation fmng to f in the following way. Okay, so this is the function that we will be using to define what we call fmn. Okay. This m stands for the order to which you know the weak coupling expansion, n stands for the order to which you know the strong coupling expansion. Okay. Now this function has been designed so that in the weak coupling limit, where this is the dominant term, you get back the leading term here. Okay. Also in the strong coupling limit, where this is the dominant term, okay, we get back this leading coefficient over here. Okay. And the idea is that we will adjust these coefficients a1 to am in such a way so that the Taylor series expansion of this function at weak coupling matches these coefficients c1 to cm, and we will adjust the coefficients b1 to bn in such a way that the Taylor series expansion of the function at strong coupling matches the coefficients d1 to dn. Okay. And one can easily verify that these ai's are polynomials in the ci's and the bi's will be polynomials in the di's. Okay, so it's reasonably straightforward to solve this. Now in this analysis, these coefficients a and b can both be positive and negative. Okay, we haven't put any restriction. The only restriction is that the two coefficients cannot be equal. If a and b are the same, then of course this whole procedure breaks down. But there is a simple remedy. Okay, that if these two exponents are the same, then all you have to do is to either subtract the leading term in the weak coupling expansion or the leading term in the strong coupling expansion from both sides, so that at least one of the exponents becomes different, and then apply this procedure. Okay. The other constraint that we have to impose is that the coefficients b and a, these leading coefficients, must have the same sign. Okay. So this procedure doesn't quite work in trying to find a function that interpolates from a negative value to a positive value. Okay, so it should have the same sign at the weak and the strong coupling ends. Now to test the efficiency of this procedure, we will go back to the function that we introduced earlier. Okay, f of g. Okay, the same function whose weak coupling expansion is an asymptotic expansion. Okay. And because this is a known function, you of course know its weak coupling expansion as well as a strong coupling expansion, so you can construct these various functions f mn. Okay. So what I have shown here is a plot of f00 over f. Okay, the leading, so this function is constructed simply by using the leading order weak coupling result and the leading order strong coupling result, and this is the plot. And you see indeed that at this level itself, okay, just by using the leading order results, okay, this function has come within 90% of the actual function. Right, this the maximum deviation that you can see goes up to 0.9. Okay. In contrast, if we had just used the weak coupling result, okay, it would have gone like this. If we had just used the strong coupling result, it would have gone like this. So the results should be quite different from what we see here. Now here is pushing it a little further. Okay, if we go up to fourth order in weak coupling and still first order in the strong coupling expansion, okay, then here is the ratio of f41 to f. Okay, you see that it's almost 1 everywhere. Okay, it's hard to distinguish this from the horizontal line. Whereas if you had just used the weak coupling expansion, it would have gone like this, and the strong coupling expansion goes like this. Okay. So in a sense, weak and strong coupling expansions together guides the function in the right way, whereas individually they are not able to do this. Okay. Now to really see the error in this function, in this interpolating function, we have plotted it on a different scale, and from this scale we see that this function, the maximum error that this function makes over this range of the whole range of coupling is about 2%. Now, so the lesson that we can draw from here is that knowing the function at two ends, we have a much better description of the function than knowing it at other end. Okay. And this is of course not an isolated example. Okay. This procedure has been tested on many other examples, okay, with similar encouraging results. Okay. And furthermore, playing with these functions basically show that if we are working at the 5 to 10% level of accuracy, which is what we will do in actual examples, then we can get a pretty good estimate of the error by just looking at the difference between successive approximations. Okay, the error in successive approximations is a good measure of how different the interpolating function is from the actual function. Okay. And what we will do in the rest of the talk is to apply this insight to both string theory and quantum field theory. Okay, one example from string theory and one example from quantum field theory. So the string theory example that we will discuss, okay, will involve SO32 heterotic string theory, no compactification. Okay. So this theory is known to contain a stable massive particle which is not BPS. It's stable because it transforms in the spinor representation of SO32, and there are no other lighter states which belong to this representation. Okay, and hence it's stable. Its strong coupling dual is also understood quite well. It's the stable non-BPS D0 brane in type 1 string theory. Okay. And the goal will be to determine the mass of this stable particle as a function of the coupling constant of the heterotic string theory. Okay, which is of course also equivalent to determining it as a function of the coupling constant of the type 1 string theory, right? Because they are related. Okay. So there is a function f of g which you don't know. Okay, but the existence of this function is of course of no doubt, because the function this is just the mass of the lightest particle with this quantum number. Now here are the results, the known weak coupling expansion, okay, and the known strong coupling expansion. Okay. So this term, okay, I should have said here that in writing these expansions I have done a suitable rescaling both of the string coupling as well as of the function f. Okay, so there is a constant that has been absorbed into f, and then there is another constant absorbed into g, so that the leading coefficients here are just 1, okay, in both of these functions. Okay. So this g to the 1/4, this is the leading heterotic string result, 3-level heterotic string result. Okay, the power looks a little unusual, but it's simply because of the fact that we write everything in the Einstein frame. Okay, so in the string frame the mass would have been 1, but when you go to the Einstein frame it goes as g to the 1/4. Okay, and similarly here we have to go from the string frame to the Einstein frame, and that's what gives rise to g to the 3/4. This coefficient here is the one loop correction to this mass. Okay, so this comes from a torus 2-point function. This can be computed explicitly, and here is the numerical value of this constant. Okay, this is numerical because evaluating this involves doing a integral over the fundamental domain of the moduli space. Okay, and that integral was done numerically. Similarly, on the type 1 side, one can calculate the correction to the mass at one loop order. Okay, get this coefficient Ks. Again, this involves a one-dimensional integral over the moduli space, over the moduli of one loop type 1 amplitudes. Okay, and this is the constant Ks that one gets. Okay. Now, using this, we can compute these functions fmn all the way up to m equal to 3, because we know the expansion up to order g cube. Right? In heterotic side, we know the next expansion is of order g to the 4, and for n less than or equal to 1, because we have got the result in type 1 side up to order g inverse. So here are the explicit forms of these functions. Okay, very easy to construct them. Okay. Now in this case, of course, we do not have a known result to compare to. We don't know what the function f is, and so we don't know a priori how accurate these functions are. But we will try to get an estimate of how accurate these functions are by comparing results at different orders. Okay. So using the numerical values of Ks and Kw that I wrote down, okay, here I have plotted the ratio of fmn to f31. F31 is the best approximation that we can get. Okay, we have gone all the way up to the 3-loop or third order in heterotic string, okay, which basically means order g cube, and first order in type 1. Okay. So here are the ratios of fmn to f31. Okay. And we see that these ratios are not very far from 1. Right? In fact, the maximum distance that the maximum departure from 1 is this dotted line over here, okay, which makes about 15% deviation from this line, okay, at the maximum. But this dotted line in fact is f00. Okay, this is the one which doesn't use any information either from the heterotic one loop or type 1 loop analysis. Okay. If you leave aside this dotted line, then the rest of the graphs, okay, are all essentially within 10% of fmn. Okay. So this also shows that this method is somewhat stable against going from order to order. We can also use other interpolation schemes, for example, Paré approximant. Okay, Paré approximant, but it uses both the strong and weak coupling information. Okay, and these also give results within 10% of F31. Okay, and so from all this, our conclusion would be that F31 most likely gives the mass of the stable non-BPS particle within 10% over the entire range of G. Okay. Now notice that we have to always add this qualification, okay, most likely, because we never know whether the answer is really true or not. Okay. Because given any function, we can always add some other function which has vanishing Taylor series expansion at both ends, okay, and completely destroy whatever prediction we make. Okay, so we basically have to rely on genericity. Okay, for a generic function, it does look like that this procedure determines a function to reasonably good accuracy. So this is more or less what I'll say about string theory. Okay, so I now turn to the next example, which will be an example in quantum field theory. So this will be an application to n equal to 4 supersymmetric Yang-Mills theories with SU and gauge group. Okay. The focus will be on non-BPS 2:2 operators of this form. Okay. So the phi i's here are the adjoint scalars, okay, the 6 adjoint scalars of the theory, and dm denotes symmetrized covariant derivative, m covariant derivatives. Okay. The conformal dimensions of these operators, okay, is given as follows. So this 2 comes from the 2 phi i's, the m comes from the m derivatives, and then there are anomalous dimensions which start receiving contribution from one loop onwards. And the perturbative result for the anomalous dimensions is known to 4 loop order for m equal to 0 and 2, and 3 loop order for m equal to 4. Okay, we could go up to higher order in m, but we'll stop at m equal to 4. Okay, for reasons that I'll explain later. So our goal will be to compute these anomalous dimensions at finite n, okay, and also at finite value of this complex coupling tau. Now, a related question was addressed by Beam, Rastrelli and Van Ries using conformal bootstrap approach. Okay, we heard about conformal bootstrap in the last talk. Okay. So what they found using the conformal bootstrap approach was a strict upper bound on the anomalous dimensions. Okay. For example, in the delta 0, delta 2 plane, okay, that I have drawn here, what they found is that for the SU2 theory, the anomalous dimensions, okay, must lie in a region bounded by this red curve over here. For the SU3 theory, they must lie in the region bounded by the green curve over here, and for the SU4 theory, they lie below this curve over here. Now the bootstrap approach that they use is totally insensitive to the complex coupling tau. Okay, so it doesn't tell us anything about what the dimensions are as functions of tau. Okay. Nevertheless, they made a bold conjecture. Okay, they looked at these curves over here, and they made a conjecture that when they increase the numerical precision, okay, these curves that you see here will become perfect rectangles, okay, and then the corners of the rectangles, okay, will correspond to the actual values of the anomalous dimensions at some point of enhanced symmetry, which could be either tau equal to I or tau equal to e to the I pi by 3. Okay, since they didn't have any direct analysis, they of course had no way of saying which one, if any one of them. So we'll be studying this, we'll be addressing this question, okay, using the method of interpolation that I described earlier. Okay. So what is the strategy? We already know the weak coupling expansion. Okay. We'll try to find the strong coupling results using a subgroup of S-duality symmetry, okay, because S-duality takes weak coupling to strong coupling, and then use the strong coupling results and the weak coupling results to construct an interpolating function in the same way that I suggested earlier. Now to generate the strong coupling result, we use two different subgroups. Okay, so there are two different sets of analysis. We use the Z2 subgroup generated by tau goes to minus 1 over tau. This keeps the point I in the complex tau plane fixed. And we will also use Z3 subgroup, which uses tau goes to tau minus 1 over tau. This keeps fixed the point e to the I pi by 3 fixed. Okay. And it turns out that the final results inside the fundamental domain of tau are fairly insensitive to which two subgroups we use. Okay, so we could use any one of them, and they essentially agree with each other within error bars. Now, the perturbation expansion that we start with, of course, has no theta dependence. Okay. But because we use S duality symmetry to generate the strong coupling expansion, and typically S duality mixes the string coupling with theta parameter, typically the S duality transformation induces a theta dependent strong coupling expansion. Okay. And as a result, the final interpolating function that we will get will acquire a theta dependence. Now, at this stage, I should just say that this procedure, okay, if it works, it's most likely to work for low values of n. Okay. There are different ways of saying this. First of all, we know that in this theory, the effective coupling is not G Young-Mills square, but really G Young-Mills square times n. Okay. And at the self-dual point, where G Young-Mills square is of order 1, okay, the effective coupling becomes larger for larger values of n. Okay. So you expect perturbation theory on which you are basing this analysis will be less efficient for larger and larger values of n. Okay. Also, at infinite n limit, okay, on in the strict infinite n limit, we know that the function that you are looking for is does not have continuous derivatives. Okay, the function has kinks; it's not a smooth function. Okay, this follows from the fact that the single trace and double trace operators don't mix in the limit of infinite n. Okay, so from all of these reasons, we expect that this analysis will be valid, if at all, only for small values of n. Okay, let me now go to describe the results that we get of this interpolation. Okay. So first of all, we find that these ratios of the anomalous dimensions, delta 2 over delta 0 and delta 4 over delta 0. So this is calculated based on results up to 4 loops. This is calculated on results based up to 3 loops, because delta 4 is not known at 4 loops. Okay. So what we find is that these remain almost constant over the whole fundamental domain of tau. Okay. And in fact, because these remain almost constant, we can evaluate them for large imaginary tau, which means weak coupling. So essentially, delta 2 over delta naught and delta 4 over delta naught are given by their one loop results. Okay. And in fact, we find that the estimates for delta 2 over delta naught and delta 4 over delta naught at any value of tau deviates from these values essentially by less than 1%. Okay. So what it shows is that all the physically allowed delta m's lie within a very narrow band around a straight line in the space of delta m's. Okay, because these ratios get fixed. So here is the straight line. Okay, I have plotted this straight line on the BRV bounds. Okay, the same bounds that we showed, and we see indeed that the straight line passes right through the corner for the SU2. Okay, and in fact, it also passes almost close to the corner for SU3, but it misses the SU4 corner by a reasonable amount. Okay. So this clearly is consistent with the BRV conjecture that this point actually corresponds to a physically realized point in the at some value of tau. Okay. Now we don't understand why for SU4 the line misses the corner. Okay, there are several reasons one can think of. Okay, the first thing that one can think of is that this analysis, as I said, is expected to be valid only for low n, and maybe perhaps even for n equal to 4, the effects that I talked about have already set in. Okay, and hence the assumption of a smooth function that you are trying to find by this interpolation method may not be totally correct for SU4. It could also be due to the fact that there are some still existing numerical errors in the BRV analysis, because after all, what they conjecture is that in the limit of infinite numerical accuracy, these curves that you get will become perfect rectangles. Okay, now clearly they still are not perfect rectangles. Okay, and so that could shift the corners by the time we go to the infinite numerical accuracy and bring these corners closer to this line. Okay, so that question is still open. Okay. But now we go to the real question. Okay, that we have said that all the allowed values more or less lie on this line or very close to this line. Okay, but what are these actual values of delta naught? Okay, so it's enough to specify delta naught, because once you specify delta naught, all the other deltas get fixed because you are on this line. So we'll now describe the actual values of delta naught for different values of tau. Okay, that we get from this interpolating function. Okay. And here is the result. Okay. So what I have plotted here, okay, are in, of course, tau is spans a two-dimensional space. Okay. But what I have plotted here is the delta naught as a function of the coupling constant, okay, on two defined lines. So one is the theta equal to 0 line, that's the imaginary tau axis, and the other one is the theta equal to pi line. Okay, these are essentially the two boundaries of the fundamental domain. Okay, because of there is a symmetry also which takes theta to minus theta. Okay. Now the codes of these lines are as follows. Okay. So the small dash, which are these lines, these are two loop results. Okay. These ones, the large dash, okay, these correspond to 3 loop results, and the continuous lines correspond to 4 loop results. Okay. Different colors for the same loop order correspond to different interpolation scheme. Okay. For example, we are using the fractional power of polynomial, you also use Pade. Okay. And we see that the different interpolation schemes are not very different from each other. Okay. And in fact, by the time you have gone to 4 loops, okay, the different interpolation schemes really give answers which are pretty close to each other. Okay, both here and here. Okay. The other thing you notice is that the 4 loop results lie in between the 2 and the 3 loop results. Okay. So this suggests that at this level the result has started oscillating. Okay, the 2, from there you jump to 3 and then you come down to 4, and so if we are lucky, then that would it could mean that eventually it will oscillate with smaller and smaller amplitude and maybe settle down to some final value at some point. Okay, or at least approach close to some final value before it goes away from it. Okay. So using this we can set an error bar. Okay, and so we have just used an ad hoc prescription that we will use the average 2 loop result as the lower error bar and the average 3 loop result as the upper error bar. Okay. Now you also notice these two lines over here. Okay. This upper line is the absolute bound that BRV found. Okay. Whereas the lower line corresponds to the corner value. Okay, so let me just go back one slide to explain what this means. So the absolute bound basically corresponds to this point over here, and the corner value corresponds to this point over here. Okay, and the two are slightly different because the absolute bound is a little above the corner value. Okay, that's what these two lines show. Okay. And we see that our results, okay, are very much consistent with the BRV bound that they found. Okay. And this is a highly, a strong consistency check of this analysis. Okay. Because if, for example, if we just use a 3 loop result, okay, and try to evaluate it, what happens at g equal to 1, okay, the result goes to some point like 4, okay, far above this bound. If you use a 4 loop result, okay, and try to evaluate it, it goes negative. Okay. So clearly, if we had just used perturbation theory, then you will not get anywhere close to what we are seeing here. Okay, this is something that you get only by using a formula that interpolates between the strong and weak coupling results. Okay. So here is a final summary, okay, of our analysis for all the theories. So what I have done here is that I have plotted the error bar. Okay, so this is the I have used squares. Okay, but the actual error bar only lies along the diagonal. Okay, so this, because we have already said that the spread in this direction is very small. Okay, so the squares are only to guide your eye. So this is at tau equal to I. Okay, the value of the delta naught delta 2 in the tau equal to I plane. Okay, it lies in this range. For SU3 it lies in this range, and for SU4 it lies in this range. And similarly, these are tau equal to I pi by 3. Okay. And given that our results are uncertain, the exact positions of the corners are also still somewhat uncertain, we see that BRV conjecture is still alive both at tau equal to I and at tau equal to the I pi by 3. Okay, it could be that either at tau equal to I or at tau equal to the I pi by 3, or even at both these points, okay, actually the corner value is realized. Okay, we really need better accuracy to distinguish between which one, if any, could represent the corner bound. Okay, so this is my last slide. Okay, there are of course various generalizations of this procedure that one can think of. Okay, in fact, more than thinking of this as generalization, these are various tests of this procedure. Okay, because for example, in using ADS CFT, we know of many exact quantities, right, which you can compute for large lambda as well as small lambda. Okay, and you can ask, if we had used this interpolation procedure, okay, on those quantities, okay, how well would you have done? Okay, and typically you find that you would have done quite well. Okay, using first few orders of results on each side. Okay, so that just shows that this procedure is reasonably stable Okay, that it works not just in one example but in several examples. Okay. In fact, we have also tried this method in other physical problems, nothing to do with quantum field theory, where the behavior of a function is known at the two ends, and again it gives good agreement with numerical results. Okay. And finally, I mean, what we find is that in some of these cases, the interpolation method itself requires slight generalization, okay, which is the fact that instead of using these interpolation methods all the way for sufficiently large m and n, we could stop at some value of f mn, okay, construct the function f minus f mn, and then repeat the process again, okay, and sometimes this is necessary to get better results for this from this procedure. So with this I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Nice talk. So are there questions? Yes.
Using the FPP formalism, is there a systematic way to actually converge to the answer as an expansion?
Let's say even so that we don't know. Well, I mean, I haven't
even
studied
for
that
the quartic,
question.
Even for the Gaussian quartic polynomial potential you wrote.
Yeah. So certainly there are some functions for which it seems to converge absolutely. Okay, by again experiment. I don't have a theory behind it, but it's something that in principle could be studied. That I mean, one could ask or for what class of function this gives an absolutely convergent procedure, right? I don't know the result, but it's a question certainly that could be addressed.
And the other question is that if you use SL2Z, you have these interesting functions. Perhaps you can use the Laplacian on the fundamental domain and look at the spectrum of the Laplacian as the expanding functions. So the geometry of the sphere and all that didn't feature in your discussion at all. Would they be in any way better? Have you tried those?
Yeah, we tried to impose the full SL2Z invariance, and we didn't get to very good results. I mean, we couldn't try to implement it in a most efficient way, but that could simply be that we haven't tried hard enough.
Okay,
right? One could try to improve this using the full SL2Z invariance.
Yes.
Caprini, Adler, Caprini, Ciulli, there's extensive work over the past 10 years
for
exactly
improving perturbative results.
So I guess you might want to combine it with what you're
That's
doing.
true, yeah. Yeah.
So there are all sorts of notions of optimal approximants according to various criteria that might be useful for you.
Yeah. Yeah, meaning for example, I mean, we know that, there are some series which are Borel summable, right? Or there are various resummation procedures that has been used for perturbative scheme. It's that it was, we couldn't find a simple way of combining that with the information from S duality. But it's certainly something that one should explore. That the usual perturbative resummation, how to combine them with the information that we gain from S duality. Okay. Okay, thank you.
Any other question? Yeah.
So you sort of mainly discussed you discussed the strong and weak coupling and the interpolating function. But supposing I took just tau as a complex parameter, if I have some quantity which is analytic in tau, can I not extend this to a complex function? And there could be many regions in the complex plane. And
of course, we can determine this for the. I have discussed this on two lines, right? That's just because to plot, it's hard to plot the two-dimensional thing, but the function that we have is a function of both the real part of tau and the imaginary part of tau.
But
right?
presumably this function is not analytic in tau. I was just wondering if there's something...
No, it's not a complex analytic function of tau.
So if there was one which was also analytic somehow, could that be combined with this approach and you get even more information, or it doesn't help if it's analytic?
Yeah, meaning there is of course the J function, right, which is used for things which are modularly invariant, which are analytic functions of tau. But this function doesn't have any complex analytic property, right? This is a real function of tau and tau bar. So
this function, I'm asking whether the technique could apply to some situation in field theory or string theory where there is an
presumably
analytic.
it can be, yes, I agree.
Yeah, we have a lot of time, so one more question. Yeah.
Can your analysis be applied when you suspect phase transition at finite G?
Not directly, because the function will have discontinuous derivatives. Right? So what I have done is to have tried to use functions which are continuous but which has discontinuous derivatives. Right? And I tried to see how it works there. Right? And what you find is that to low orders, if you work to low orders, then this interpolation method tries very hard to generate a function which is a smooth interpolation. Okay? But if you push this to sufficiently high order, then it's slowly start becoming kinkier and kinkier. Right? So by doing low order expansion, certainly you will not discover phase transition, but if you could go to sufficiently high order, okay, and maybe under certain conditions, you may see that the function becomes kinkier and kinkier as you try to increase the order, and that will be a signal that there is a kind of phase transition. But it's very hard unless you have very high order expansions.
Yeah, let's thank speaker again.
Thank you.
Thank you.